Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over what we didn't get to finish in class before the film. So, because of cultural values around women's sexuality, research shows that men often do not see a woman asking for a sex act to stop to be sincere. So there's this idea that like women are somehow like the gatekeepers to their vaginas, and that a woman wants something but feels the shame of wanting it, so she says she doesn't want it, but truly she does. And so this societal notion really questions whether or not, no means no. And no does mean no. It's very clear. That's what it means. So when it comes to the role of alcohol and sexual assault, alcohol makes issues more complicated for men and women because consent often gets muddled. So women who are intoxicated are less aware and typically less uncomfortable by the cues that sexual assault may take place. So what might seem obvious to the person that's not intoxicated is not obvious to the person who is drunk. So that's like a whole nother issue. There's a lot of research that focuses on the male culture fraternities and sports organizations and the acceptance and use of rape and sexual assault within these cultures. So part of the problem is that the definition of masculinity means that you have to constantly prove yourself, and one of the ways that men are, told to prove themselves is through sexual conquest, right? So that's a huge problem because, instead of discouraging men from taking advantage of women, um, men are encouraging each other to take advantage of women in order to prove that they are real men. So this kind of leads to this misperception that a lot of men have that if a woman is friendly, that she's interested in them sexually, right? So men in research, like they talked about in the book, consistently overperceive their opposite sex friends' sexual interest in them, meaning like women in the studies, they would basically have a pretty good idea about which ones of their friends liked them, but men would assume that all of their female friends had a sexual interest in them. So that's kind of like that, the modern version of this is what they call the friend zone, right? This assumption that basically like the underlying ideology of the friend zone is that when the only point of why a man would hang out with a woman is to have sex with her. So if she doesn't like him or spurns his advances, he's been put in the friend zone. And so of course this can be complicated as people often, if you have a friend, sometimes they have different perceptions than you do about these things. But overall, as a cultural problem, this is this idea that there's like some sort of entitlement, right? Like, I was nice to you, therefore I deserve this, that comes from these interactions, which leads to a really, big problem, especially on college campuses, with the misunderstanding of consent. So gender socialization, obviously, gender is a big organizing principle in society, and traditional gender role beliefs feed into, the rape myths and all those ideas, especially when it comes to male attitudes of sexual entitlement. When it comes to policy and prevention, obviously we need to have some sort of public awareness campaigns so that we can make the general public understand that these issues are important, and if we want them to change, we have to address it. So part of this comes through prevention. So, the majority of programs focus on controlling women's behaviors to avoid victimization instead of changing male behaviors about women being sexual objects. So that's a big problem because you're focusing on the effects instead of preventing it from happening in the first place. So there needs to be more courses like the one that, we're taking here, 385. It's so rare that people get to hear this information in an educational setting and actually talk about it and digest it and, think about how this relates to people's lives. So that's kind of a big one. Also, there needs to be more perpetrator focused prevention. So research has shown that focusing on male attitudes can be very successful. And one element of these programs is helping men see behaviors that are considered to be sexually aggressive so that they can be advocates to end the violence and help others, right? So I kind of already prefaced this in class the other day about how it does use its own kind of form of benevolent sexism, some of these programs. So I'll show you an example of that in a second. And then there's also, they use this thing called the rape attitude scale to try and understand the different components of rape myth acceptance. So first they look at entitlement, right? And then they look at shifting blame from perpetrator to victim, how there's the relationship between rape attitudes and traditional gender role beliefs. And then the fourth one is this idea that, there's these rape myths that say that if a man is turned on, he has to, um, basically like if a sex act starts, it has to finish kind of thing. Which, anyway, ridiculous. Okay, so here's the thing I was talking about. Obviously, it takes, it kind of tries to deal with culture's definition of masculinity. And instead of turning it into like not caring about women and the whatever, it's more about standing up and being a man, right? So when Carl kept harassing girls on the street, I said, stop being a jerk. I'm the kind of guy who takes a stand, right? This guy over here. Or, when Jason wouldn't leave Mary alone, I said, she's not into you anymore. Let it go. You know, all of these kind of things here, right? These like, where do you stand, blah, blah, blah. It is much more perpetrator focused, and that's a good thing that needs to happen. And really turning men from being kind of in these uncomfortable situations where they often see men treating women awfully, but giving them the kind of agency and comfort to stand up to other men and explain to them that it's not acceptable. All right, so this is the same kind of thing, but again, using the tagline, my strength is not for hurting, right? So again, playing into the societal conceptions of masculinity and femininity, but again, at least they're countering rape myths, so that's good. So when she said no, I said okay. When she changed her mind, I stopped. When she was drunk, I backed off. When she wanted me to stop, I stopped. Those kind of things, right? It's pretty obvious. I mean, it seems like a basic kind of thing, but these campaigns obviously are not like the end all be all of fixing problems. They have their own inherently sexist logic to them, but it's a better step towards, something much more positive and talking about consent and seeing a person as a person and not just as a sex object. Okay, so stalking, definition wise, with many forms of family violence, the definition has changed as more research has come about. So, stalking is defined as harassing, threatening behavior that an individual engages in repeatedly, such as following someone, showing up at their house, going to their job, making harassing phone calls, vandalizing property. And recently, cyberstalking has become another issue as now people are on the internet and it's much easier to, kind of track and monitor them that way. So there's large discrepancies in estimates. Some estimates are as low as 16,000, some are as high as 65,000. That's a huge difference in prevalence. So some of the consequences that come from stalking, obviously the first would be psychological stuff, being angry because this person is intruding upon your life and your well-being, being fearful because you're being followed and monitored. There's also environmentally protective reactions, meaning, oftentimes if someone's being stalked, they're going to improve their security situations. So either install new locks, get an alarm, get caller ID, buy a weapon, take a self-defense class, those kind of things. When it comes to the traits of the people that are involved in stalking, on the surface, it seems that stalkers suffer from some sort of mental illness or personality disorder. But other research describes them as common criminals that are typically rejected lovers or people with attachment issues that don't know to like kick rocks. So there's differing degrees. Of course, researchers look at the different levels of stalking from non-harassers to severe harassers in order to try and understand the patterns that are going on there. So the first they find is personality disorders or mental illness. So there are a few kinds of these stalkers, like paraphilic. These are people that have like bizarre fantasies for sexual excitement. So like, people that like have to expose themselves or look at others or something to gain arousal. There's cyber stalkers, antisocial stalkers, right? But typically, a lot more stalkers are actually just jilted lovers, ex-lovers. When it comes to victims' responses, how victims respond to stalking varies. Some don't alter their lives at all, right? Some research found that white women were more likely to be afraid of stalking, and that black women, and that frequently being stalked evoked more concern than being stalked only once, and being stalked by an intimate caused more concern than being stalked by a stranger, right? So that's interesting. So when it comes to explaining it, it's unclear why some people decide to stalk other people. Often it can be to prevent them from dating someone else, prevent them from leaving, or, gaining a future relationship. So because the stalker and the victim are acquainted, the stalker knows things about the victim's life that can be used against them, such as where they live, where they work, all that kind of stuff. When it comes to childhood factors, um, harsh parental discipline is associated with the need to control a dating partner through stalking. So if someone went through harsh discipline as a kid, they often develop an anxious attachment, which, can lead to stalking, because stalking, you're trying to like regain that control through stalking someone. When it comes to policy, college campuses need to provide more information about stalking to students to combat misunderstandings and lower the prevalence of incidents. So, when it comes to the criminal justice system, there's different definitions of stalking, and some are too narrow or too broad, but the criminal justice system intervention is shown to lessen incidents of stalking. So, there's a strong need for anti stalking legislation. There also needs to be modifications to bail rules to make sure that stalkers are, basically to stop them from reoffending. So workplaces also need to implement precautions, because a lot of people violate these protective orders while people are at work. And obviously, if you're in a situation at work, you're going to be very uncomfortable and there's not much you can really do in that situation, right? Okay, so when it comes to domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking in marginalized communities, when it comes to same-sex sexual assault, people in the LGBT community have their incidents lumped into the general statistics, but little attention is paid to this marginalized community and how rates and incidents of sexual assault may differ among this community. So when it comes to disclosure, differences are found based on sexual orientation. So for example, heterosexual women were more likely to report completed rapes, and lesbians were more frequently assaulted by a family member than heterosexual women were. Also in the research, they found that experiences of bisexual women differed significantly. They were more likely to disclose to formal sources of support like religious personnel, medical personnel, police, rape crisis personnel, or to mental health professionals, or to a romantic partner. So your sexuality can affect even your likelihood of disclosure and who you're going to disclose to. So when it comes to students' attitudes, most don't really care or understand the perspectives of those people on the margins. So research on college students found that they take sexual orientation and that they, often will take sexual orientation into account, but the stronger mediator of their attitudes revolve around the gender of the victim and the gender of the perpetrator. So again, meaning that in the larger patriarchal view, we consider violence against women as more important than violence against men. So yeah, even as we apply that kind of heteronormative ideas to same-sex communities. So when it comes to prevention, laws have finally started to include sexual orientation, but there's still a lot of misinformation that remains out there. So, a big part of that is that men have largely been excluded from programs for rape survivors, but that needs to be extended so that they can get the kind of support and help that they need as well. When it comes to cross-cultural domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, researchers have only recently begun to obtain estimates of dating violence and sexual assault among these other minority populations. So, we can see how different cultural values affect understandings and actions against dating violence and sexual assault. So culture has an effect on whether we justify the violence or not, whether we understand it's something romantic or not. So, for example, in our culture, we have this issue with jealousy. Culture can really play an impact on our understandings of that, meaning that some cultures that condemn violence against women accept it, but just under certain conditions. When it comes to ethnic domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, investigations have routinely ignored how diverse ethnic populations differ from the white norm in rates of DVSA and stalking. So, when researching diverse populations, the findings, like they talk about in your book, show that East Asian and Latina women report significantly higher rates of father to mother abuse than other groups. Hispanics are also less likely to experience stalking than non Hispanic women. And African Americans saw lower levels of stalking, with American Indians being the least stalked group, at least when it comes to the reported incidents. Remember, all of the data that we're basing this on is often somewhat flawed. So when it comes to DV and IPV, witnessing community violence was positively associated with perpetrating IPV. So meaning that where you live and the kind of, atmosphere that you live in your neighborhood is going to affect your, perceptions or understandings of the use of violence. So males reporting the highest exposure to community violence and the highest level of association with violent males are the ones who ended up perpetrating the highest levels of IPV. So who you hang out with, how they understand violence has an impact on your understanding and use of violence.